Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does a man finally begin to feel everything? Only after she's gone? Not because losing her is romantic. Not because absence is some magical teacher. Sometimes it's much smaller than that. Sometimes he's just standing in the grocery store, reaching for the cereal she used to buy without thinking, and his hand freezes. Sometimes it's hearing a laugh that almost sounds like hers. Sometimes it's realizing the silence he asked for doesn't actually feel peaceful. It just echoes. People love saying, "He'll wake up when she disappears." Maybe. But not in the way most people imagine. Because what disappears isn't only her. It's the version of himself that could keep pretending nothing mattered. And that's where everything quietly begins to fall apart. He didn't leave because he stopped caring. I know that's probably not what some people want to hear. It's easier to believe he was cold, selfish, unaffected. Sometimes he was those things. But those aren't always the reasons someone walks away. Sometimes they leave because staying keeps making them feel things they don't know how to carry. And strangely, that feels even more terrifying. He kept saying he needed space. Not dramatically. Not during a fight where plates were breaking or voices were raised. It was quieter than that. "I just need some time. I've got a lot going on. I don't want to drag you into my mess." Those sentences sound responsible. Almost mature. But sometimes they're only half true. The other half stays trapped in his throat. The half that sounds more like, "I don't know why being loved feels like pressure. I don't know why every time we get closer, I suddenly want to disappear. I don't know why your kindness makes me feel guilty instead of safe." Those are much harder sentences to say. So he doesn't. He says he needs space instead. Because space sounds reasonable. Fear doesn't. I've watched men convince themselves they're making the healthy decision while quietly running from emotions they can't even name. Not because they're manipulative. Sometimes because they're genuinely confused. Confused people don't always look confused. Sometimes they look calm. They answer texts a little slower. They bury themselves in work. They suddenly decide the garage needs cleaning. Or they start going to the gym every evening after never caring about fitness before. Anything that creates movement. Anything except sitting still. Because stillness is loud. There was a moment. I remember something like this almost too clearly. She looked at him across the kitchen while making coffee. Nothing special about the morning. The window was open. A dog was barking somewhere outside. The kettle clicked off. She asked him, "Are you okay?" Not accusing. Not suspicious. Just soft. And something inside him tightened. Such a simple question. 3 words. "Are you okay?" His shoulders stiffened before his mouth answered. "I'm fine." He wasn't. But his body had already chosen the answer. It's strange how quickly the nervous system learns old survival habits. Before thought. Before honesty. The body protects first. The mind explains later. People think emotional avoidance always looks obvious. It doesn't. Sometimes avoidance looks polite. Helpful. Reliable. He still fixes her sink. Still carries heavy boxes. Still remembers to buy her favorite coffee. Still kisses her forehead before leaving. Then somehow, he becomes emotionally unavailable in the middle of doing all those loving things. That's the confusing part. You can be physically present, while emotionally halfway out the door. I think that's what many people misunderstand. He wasn't planning to lose her. He was trying to lower the volume inside himself. Those are different things. At least, he believed they were. Maybe if we stop talking every day, I'll feel less overwhelmed. That seemed logical. Didn't it? Except feelings rarely follow logic. Distance doesn't erase emotion. It delays it. Sometimes by days. Sometimes by months. Sometimes until the exact moment life finally becomes quiet enough that there's nowhere left to run. The first afternoon after they stopped talking, he actually felt lighter. That's the uncomfortable truth. Relief came first. No more wondering if he was enough. No more difficult conversations. No more pressure to explain emotions he barely understood himself. He drove home with the windows down. Music louder than usual. Stopped for food. Watched 2 episodes of something he'd already seen. Even laughed. For a few hours. He honestly believed he had made the right decision. People rarely admit this part. Because it sounds cruel. But emotional relief after separation is real. Especially for someone who has felt overwhelmed for a long time. Relief doesn't prove he didn't love her. It often proves he had been carrying something he didn't know how to hold. Then night arrived. Night has a way of undoing stories we tell ourselves during daylight. The apartment sounded different. Not sad. Just unfinished. He noticed there wasn't a message waiting. Normally she'd send something small. A photo of a sunset. A joke she saw online. Some random thought about nothing. Nothing important. Until it stopped happening. He unlocked his phone anyway. Saw nothing. Locked it. Opened it again 30 seconds later without realizing he'd done it. Not because he expected her to text. Just because his hands remembered the routine. It's amazing how habits survive after relationships stop. His thumb still knew where her conversation sat. Even after it slowly slipped lower in the message list. He almost sent something. Not emotional. Just, "You home?" He typed it. Looked at it. Deleted it. That became a habit too. Typing. Deleting. Typing. Deleting. As if unsent messages could somehow count as communication. Leave her alone. Yeah. You asked for space. I know. So why are you opening the chat? I'm not going to send anything. Then why are you here? No answer. Just the blinking cursor. The strange thing is, his pride wasn't stronger than his love. It was stronger than his certainty. Those aren't the same thing. If he knew exactly what he felt, he probably would have stayed. But uncertainty makes people do strange things. Especially men who've learned to mistake emotional confusion for a sign they should leave. He told his friends things were fine. Just taking some time. They nodded. Changed the subject. Talked about work. Sports. Money. Weekend plans. Nobody asked. What scared you? Nobody asked. What happened inside you? Honestly, most men don't ask each other those questions. Sometimes we wouldn't know how to answer, even if someone did. Days passed. Life kept moving. Emails. Traffic. Groceries. Meetings. Laundry piling up on the chair instead of being folded. Little ordinary things. That's what surprises people. The beginning of Disappearance doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. Painfully ordinary. The coffee still needs making. The trash still goes out. The alarm still rings at 6:30. The world refuses to pause because your heart doesn't know what it's doing. And somewhere inside all those ordinary moments, something almost invisible began happening. Not regret. Not yet. Just small interruptions. He reached for his phone before remembering. He saw a movie trailer she'd probably like. His first instinct was to send it. His finger hovered over the share button. Then stopped. A tiny moment. 5 seconds. Nobody else would have noticed. But that's how absence enters. Not through grand realizations. Through interrupted habits. Through reflexes with nowhere to land. He kept telling himself, I just need more time. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he needed to believe it. Because admitting something else would have been much harder. That maybe the space wasn't creating peace. It was only postponing whatever was waiting for him on the other side of silence. And silence has a strange patience. It doesn't chase anyone. It simply waits. It lets the distractions wear off. It lets the relief settle. It lets the routines repeat until they begin to feel hollow. Then one ordinary Tuesday, for no obvious reason at all, he finds himself standing in the kitchen, staring at 2 coffee mugs. One he uses. One she always reached for. He stands there longer than necessary, almost annoyed at himself. It's just a mug. Is it? Maybe. Or maybe it was the first moment he realized that what disappeared wasn't only her voice. It was the version of himself that had someone waiting to hear it. And he wasn't ready to admit that yet. Not even to himself. For a while. The silence actually feels like success. That's the part almost nobody talks about. People imagine that the moment she disappears, he immediately falls apart. He usually doesn't. He wakes up, goes to work, answers emails, laughs at something stupid someone says in the office, stops for gas, forgets she isn't texting him for almost 3 hours. Life has a strange way of protecting us at first. It gives us routines before it gives us reality. He tells himself he's adjusting. This is what I wanted. Or at least, this is what I thought I needed. Those 2 sentences sound similar. They're not. One comes from certainty. The other comes from hope. Hope that the discomfort will disappear if he just keeps moving. So he moves. He stays later at work. He says yes to plans he normally would have declined. He scrolls longer before bed. He watches videos he doesn't even enjoy. He leaves the television running while he folds laundry just to keep the apartment from sounding so empty. Funny how we pretend background noise is company. The silence doesn't attack all at once. It waits. Patiently. It lets his body keep believing everything is normal. Then little things begin slipping through. Not dramatic things. Tiny things. The kind that make absolutely no sense until they start happening every day. He walks into the grocery store. No list. Just grabbing whatever he needs. Bread. Eggs. Coffee. Then he reaches the yogurt aisle. His hand automatically grabs the strawberry flavor. Halfway to the shopping cart. He stops. She was the one who liked strawberry. He always bought vanilla. He stares at the container for a second. Actually smiles. Kind of shakes his head. What am I doing? He puts it back. Keeps walking. 30 seconds later. He's irritated. Not because of the yogurt. Because his own hands remembered something his mind had been trying not to think about. It's unsettling when your habits betray you. People think missing someone begins inside the heart. Sometimes it begins in muscle memory. Your body remembers before your thoughts catch up. Your hands. Your feet. Your eyes. They've been living beside someone for months. Sometimes years. They've learned hundreds of tiny routines without asking permission. Which side of the bed feels occupied? Which coffee mug belongs to who? How long she usually takes to answer? Where she sits in the restaurant? What song she always skips? The body archives ordinary love. Quietly. Without making announcements. Then one day. Those routines have nowhere to go. He doesn't call it grief. Honestly. He probably calls it being distracted. I'm just tired. I've been busy. I haven't been sleeping well. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's all true. But exhaustion sometimes carries emotions that haven't found language yet. There was another small moment. One that almost sounds ridiculous. He was driving home from work. Traffic barely moving. Windows cracked open. A warm evening. Nothing memorable. Then another car pulled up beside him. Someone inside was laughing. Not her. Not even close. Just the rhythm. Something about the way that woman threw her head back reminded him of her. For 1 second, his stomach dropped. His chest reacted before his brain corrected itself. His foot almost slipped off the brake. Then the light turned green. The moment disappeared. Except, it didn't. Because his body had already believed she was nearby. For one impossible second, he forgot she wasn't part of his everyday world anymore. It's strange what the nervous system does. It creates false arrivals. You think you saw them. You think you heard them. You think that person walking ahead has the same jacket, same hair, same walk. Your heart speeds up. Then they turn around. Wrong person. Again. He never tells anyone about these moments. They're too embarrassing. Imagine trying to explain to your friend. I accidentally followed someone through a parking lot because I thought it was her. Not intentionally. Not in a creepy way. Just. Hope moved faster than logic. So he keeps those stories to himself. The difficult part isn't always missing her. Sometimes it's realizing how much of his day quietly included her. Without either of them noticing. He makes coffee. Looks toward the chair she used to sit in while waiting for it to cool. Nobody's there. He starts watching a show. Halfway through the episode, he reaches for his phone to tell her about one funny scene. Stops. Locks the screen. Keeps watching. Doesn't even remember what the joke was. He starts collecting unfinished actions. Things that used to end with her. Now they simply stop. Midway. Like sentences with no period. He sees an article she'd probably send him. Doesn't open it. He hears a song she'd laugh at. Changes the station. Not because it hurts too much. Because it hurts just enough. Those are different experiences. Extreme pain demands attention. Small pain quietly follows you everywhere. One night, he accidentally opens her social media. Not intentionally. At least that's what he tells himself. His thumb moved before he thought about it. Almost automatic. He looks at the profile picture. Nothing new. Checks when she was last active. Then immediately feels ridiculous. What exactly am I expecting? He doesn't know. Maybe proof she's sad. Maybe proof she's okay. Maybe proof she misses him. Maybe proof she doesn't. Any answer feels dangerous. So he closes the app. 5 minutes later. He opens it again. I said I wasn't going to check. You weren't. So why did I? No answer. Again. People love saying men don't think about the woman after she leaves. I don't think that's accurate. I think many men think about her in ways that don't look emotional from the outside. They're not crying every night. They're replaying tiny logistics. Wondering if she found a new coffee shop. Wondering if she still takes the same road home. Wondering whether she still sleeps with that fan on because she was always too warm. The mind reaches for ordinary details before it reaches for declarations of love. Because ordinary details feel safer. He remembers something she once said. Not because it sounded profound. Because at the time, he barely listened. She had been standing by the sink drying dishes. She looked exhausted. Not angry. Just tired. She said quietly, I feel like you're here. But you're somewhere else too. He answered too quickly. No, I'm not. End of conversation. Or so he thought. Weeks later, those words return. Out of nowhere. While brushing his teeth. I feel like you're here. But you're somewhere else too. He spits the toothpaste into the sink. Looks at himself in the mirror. Actually stops brushing. Because suddenly, she wasn't accusing him. She was describing him. There's a difference. And he hadn't heard it back then. Regret rarely arrives shouting. It usually whispers. Over and over. Until one sentence you've heard 100 times suddenly means something completely different. The strange irony is, he's becoming more emotionally available now. But she's no longer standing in front of him. That realization feels unfair. Mostly because he knows she probably needed this version of him months ago. Not now. He starts noticing couples everywhere. Not because there are suddenly more of them. Because his attention has changed. The older couple sharing fries. The woman asleep on someone's shoulder during a flight. The man absent-mindedly fixing his partner's hood because it's raining. Tiny acts. Invisible before. Painfully visible now. He catches himself thinking, I would have done that. Would he? Maybe. Sometimes. Other times. He would have been distracted by work. Or scrolling. Or worrying about something he couldn't control. Memory has a habit of editing us into better people. He knows that. At least part of him does. Would you have appreciated her if she'd stayed? I think so. You think so? That I don't know. Honest silence. That's new. Months ago, he would have defended himself immediately. Now, he hesitates. Not because he enjoys blaming himself. Because certainty has started leaving him. And strangely, that's where real reflection begins. Not with confidence. With questions. The silence he asked for is changing shape. At first it felt spacious. Now it feels observant. It watches him. It notices every unfinished habit. Every unsent message. Every automatic glance toward the passenger's seat. Every time he reaches for his phone before remembering there's nobody waiting anymore. And that's when he begins to understand something he wasn't ready to admit in the beginning. Silence doesn't stay empty. If you remain inside it long enough. It slowly fills with every feeling you postponed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just one ordinary moment after another. One grocery aisle. One traffic light. One coffee mug. One sentence replayed in the bathroom mirror. Until eventually, the absence no longer feels like something that happened to him. It begins to feel like somewhere he lives. And for the first time since he walked away, he can't distract himself from hearing his own thoughts. People often imagine regret as one dramatic moment. A phone call. A breakdown. A sleepless night where everything suddenly makes sense. I don't think that's how it usually happens. At least. Not for someone who's spent years learning how to stay one step ahead of his own emotions. He doesn't miss her all at once. He misses her in pieces. Tiny pieces. Scattered through ordinary days. And somehow, those tiny pieces hurt more than one big collapse ever could. The strange thing is, his life still looks functional. He's showing up to work. He's answering messages. He's paying bills. His friends probably think he's doing okay. If they asked, he'd probably shrug. I'm all right. I've just been busy. Busy is a useful word. Busy can hide almost anything. Loneliness. Regret. Fear. Shame. Confusion. Nobody argues with busy. One Saturday morning he wakes up without an alarm. For a second. He forgets. It's one of those strange moments between sleeping and being fully awake. The room feels familiar. The light coming through the curtains looks the same. His first instinct is to roll over. Maybe reach for her. Maybe ask if she wants breakfast. Then reality arrives quietly. The other side of the bed hasn't been occupied for weeks. He doesn't cry. He just stares at the ceiling longer than usual. It's amazing how quickly hope can disappear in the span of 5 seconds. He finally gets up. Makes coffee. Doesn't bother with breakfast. The apartment is unusually clean. Cleaner than when she lived there. That sounds backwards. But sometimes men clean after emotional overwhelm. Not because they suddenly enjoy organization. Because scrubbing something gives the hands somewhere to put anxious energy. He wipes the kitchen counter twice. Reorganizes the spice rack. Throws away expired sauce packets. Finds one tiny hair tie behind the toaster. Black. stretching slightly from being old. He freezes. Just for a second. It's ridiculous. It's literally a hair tie. He turns it over in his fingers, then laughs at himself. Quietly. Almost embarrassed. You've got to be kidding me. He throws it away. 5 minutes later. He opens the trash can. Pulls it back out. Sets it on the counter. He tells himself it's because it's still useful. Maybe. Or maybe throwing away small objects feels too much like admitting someone is actually gone. Grief has strange rituals. Nobody teaches us about those. He starts driving more at night. Not because he has somewhere to go. Just driving. Windows down. Music low enough that he can still hear his own thoughts. Streetlights sliding across the windshield. Gas station coffee sitting untouched in the cup holder. He tells himself he's clearing his head. Maybe he is. Or maybe movement feels easier than sitting in a quiet apartment. Sometimes motion becomes emotional anesthesia. There was one intersection. One he'd driven through dozens of times with her. She always complained about how long the light took. Every single time. Without fail. You think they forgot about us? She'd smile while saying it. He used to roll his eyes. You're impatient. No. I'm just hungry. Same joke. Every time. Back then he thought it was repetitive. Now. He waits at that same light. Silence. No joke. The light changes. He doesn't move immediately because he's suddenly remembering a conversation he never realized he'd memorized. The driver behind him honks. He flinches. Drives on. But the memory stays. Funny, isn't it? The things we think we'll remember. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Big arguments. Sometimes fade. The things that survive are strangely ordinary. The stupid jokes. The way she always stole fries even after saying she wasn't hungry. The way she'd tap the dashboard whenever a song she liked came on. Nobody prepares you for how ordinary memories become sacred after someone disappears. He begins noticing that his phone battery lasts much longer now. It bothers him more than it should. Because it means he's not checking messages as often. Not sending random photos. Not having ongoing conversations throughout the day. One afternoon, he actually catches himself thinking, my battery used to be dead by dinner. Such a strange thing to miss. Not the phone. The reason it used to die. He scrolls through old photos. Not intentionally. He's looking for a receipt. Or maybe a picture of something he bought months ago. Then suddenly, there she is. Not posing. Not smiling at the camera. She's looking out a restaurant window while waiting for food. She doesn't even know the picture exists. He remembers taking it because the sunlight looked nice. Back then it meant nothing. Now it feels impossible to delete. He zooms in. Not on her face. On her hand resting on the table. He notices the chipped nail polish she'd apologized for. He remembers saying, I didn't even notice. He hadn't. Until now. Now he notices everything. Too late. There's something painfully human about delayed attention. Sometimes we appreciate details only after they stop appearing. Why didn't you look harder? I thought I was. Were you? That I don't know. No. No. I don't think I was. That's the conversation that starts happening. Not with her. With himself. And it's much harder to win. His friends invite him out. He goes. They're watching a game. Talking loudly. Someone orders wings. Someone else complains about work. Everything feels normal. Almost comforting. Until somebody casually asks. So, you heard from her? Such an ordinary question. His body answers before his mouth. His shoulders tense. His stomach tightens. No. Just one word. No. The conversation moves on. Nobody notices how long it takes him to swallow after saying it. Later that night, he sits in his parked car outside his apartment. Engine off. Doesn't go inside. He's not avoiding the apartment exactly. He's delaying it. There's a difference. Inside is quiet. The car still feels temporary. Safe somehow. Like he's between places. Between versions of himself. He stays there for 23 minutes. Not because he's doing anything. He's just there. Watching people carry groceries upstairs. Listening to someone laugh from another balcony. Thinking about absolutely nothing. Thinking about everything. Eventually he walks inside. Drops his keys in the same bowl. Kicks off his shoes. The apartment smells neutral. That surprises him. He'd expected it to smell like her forever. Instead, it smells like nothing. Oddly enough. That hurts more. Because scent disappearing means time has actually passed. He opens the refrigerator. Almost empty. He suddenly realizes he's been eating the same 3 meals for weeks. Frozen dinners. Coffee. Takeout. Not because he can't cook. Because cooking for one feels strangely unnecessary. She used to make grocery lists. He used to tease her for writing everything down. Now he walks through the supermarket forgetting half the things he came for. Turns out, she wasn't just remembering groceries. She was remembering pieces of their shared life. Invisible labor rarely becomes visible until it disappears. One evening, he finally decides to cook something properly. Nothing complicated. Pasta. He reaches into the cabinet. Automatically grabs 2 bowls. Stops. Stares. Puts one back. Keeps cooking. A few minutes later, without thinking, he serves enough for 2 people. He doesn't even realize until the pot is empty. He looks at the food. Looks around the kitchen. Actually laughs. But this time, his eyes burn a little. Nobody sees moments like these. Nobody posts them online. Nobody tells their friends. I accidentally made dinner for someone who doesn't live here anymore. Those moments stay private. Almost sacred. He starts realizing something uncomfortable. He didn't lose her in one day. He keeps losing her. Every routine. Every expectation. Every automatic movement. It's like grief refuses to happen all at once. Instead, it keeps introducing itself over and over. Oh, you forgot she won't call after work anymore. Oh, you forgot nobody's waiting to hear how your meeting went. Oh, you forgot you're the only one buying groceries now. The losses arrive in installments. Sometimes he gets angry. Not at her. At himself. He starts replaying conversations differently. Not rewriting history exactly. Just hearing them with new ears. She once said, "I don't need you to fix everything." He answered, "Then what do you want me to do?" She looked at him for a long second. "I want you to stay in the conversation." He remembers feeling irritated. He thought she was asking for something impossible. Now, months later, he finally understands. She wasn't asking him to solve anything. She was asking him not to emotionally leave the room. Funny how understanding sometimes arrives after the person who needed to be understood has already walked away. His body begins changing too. He sleeps lighter. Wakes up around 3 in the morning for no obvious reason. Sometimes he reaches for his phone. Sometimes he just lies there listening to the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. The apartment makes noises he never noticed before. Pipes. Air vents. Floorboards settling. Silence has layers. You only hear them after another person's breathing disappears. I miss her. Do you? I miss who I was with her. Which is it? I think it's both. Finally. An answer that doesn't need to choose. Because that's the truth nobody likes to admit. Sometimes he isn't only grieving the woman. He's grieving the version of himself that only existed when she was there. The man who laughed a little easier. The man who had someone to text after a difficult meeting. The man who unconsciously bought 2 movie tickets instead of 1. The man who believed tomorrow would probably look a lot like today. Her absence quietly dismantled all of those versions too. And that's why the grief keeps arriving in fragments. Not because his feelings are weak. Not because he never loved her. But because ordinary life keeps discovering new places where she used to exist. 1 coffee. 1 empty passenger seat. 1 grocery list. 1 traffic light. 1 extra bowl. 1 sleepless night. 1 ordinary day after another. Until eventually, he realizes he wasn't avoiding missing her. He was simply living too fast to notice that every ordinary moment had already begun carrying her shape. And by the time he finally notices, the silence no longer feels temporary. It feels like a language he's slowly, reluctantly learning to understand. It's strange what survives after a relationship ends. You'd think it would be the vacations, the anniversaries, the first kiss, the nights where everything felt perfect. Sometimes those memories blur surprisingly fast. But 1 ordinary conversation, 1 sentence spoken on an average Tuesday, can stay with someone for years. Not because it sounded important at the time, because they didn't understand it until she was already gone. Memory has an unfair way of changing. It doesn't simply replay what happened. It slows everything down, adds details you never noticed, removes the noise, leaves you alone with 1 sentence that suddenly means something completely different. He isn't replaying the relationship anymore. He's replaying moments, little fragments, a look on her face, the pause before she answered, the way she sighed when she realized he wasn't really listening. At the time, he thought those pauses meant nothing. Now they feel louder than every argument they ever had. One evening he's sitting alone after work. Laptop still open. Emails unanswered. A cup of coffee gone cold beside him. Outside, someone is mowing the lawn. Children are laughing somewhere down the street. Life sounds painfully normal. He isn't thinking about her. At least, he doesn't think he is. Then he notices the coffee. Cold. Again. She used to tease him about that. You never actually drink hot coffee. I get distracted. You don't get distracted. What then? You disappear. He laughed. What does that even mean? She shrugged. You're sitting right here. And then suddenly you're somewhere else. He smiled. Changed the subject. Asked what they were having for dinner. Conversation over. Or so he thought. Now, months later, he hears those words again. You disappear. Not physically. Emotionally. He had heard the sentence. He just hadn't understood it. There's a difference. People often think regret comes from remembering what they did. Sometimes regret comes from finally hearing what someone had been trying to tell them all along. He starts replaying conversations while doing ordinary things. Driving. Taking a shower. Waiting in line for coffee. The brain loves unfinished business. Especially when there's finally enough silence to hear it. I wasn't asking you to fix me. She had said that once. He remembers answering almost immediately. I know. Did he? Maybe he thought he did. But looking back, every conversation had quietly become a problem he was trying to solve. If she was sad, he offered solutions. If she felt disconnected, he explained why she shouldn't. If she cried, he searched for the fastest way to stop the tears. He believed that was love. He believed helping meant repairing. He never considered that maybe. She simply wanted someone to remain present while things were messy. It's uncomfortable realizing that good intentions can still create distance. He remembers one rainy evening. She had come home exhausted. Shoes soaked. Hair wet from running through the parking lot. She dropped her bag by the door. Didn't say much. Just sat on the couch. He looked up from his laptop. Tough day. She nodded. For a while. Neither of them spoke. Eventually she whispered, I don't think I have anything left today. He interpreted that as a problem. Immediately. You should quit. No. Then maybe ask for fewer hours. It's not that. You need better boundaries. She closed her eyes. He kept talking. Advice after advice. Possible solution after possible solution. Finally, she looked at him. Not angry. Not frustrated. Just tired. I wasn't asking you what to do. Silence. I just wanted you to sit with me. Back then. He honestly didn't know what she meant. Sit with you? We're already sitting together. Wasn't that enough? Now. He understands she wasn't talking about physical distance. She meant emotional presence. There's an enormous difference between sharing a couch and sharing the same emotional space. He had confused the two. The difficult part about reflection is this. You don't simply remember events. You remember who you were inside them. And sometimes, you don't particularly like that version of yourself. He begins noticing a pattern. Not because someone explained it to him. Because every memory keeps ending the same way. She reaches toward him emotionally. He reaches toward fixing the situation. She wants connection. He offers efficiency. She wants understanding. He offers logic. Neither of them realizes they're speaking completely different languages. No wonder they both left conversations feeling alone. One night he can't sleep. Again. 3:13 in the morning. The digital clock glows blue across the room. He turns onto one side. Then the other. Eventually he gives up. Walks into the kitchen. Pours water. Leans against the counter. And suddenly, one sentence appears from nowhere. Almost perfectly. You don't have to be okay around me. She had said it softly. Months ago. He barely reacted. Now, standing barefoot in his kitchen, he realizes something that steals the air from his lungs. He never believed her. Not really. Because somewhere much earlier in his life, long before she arrived, he had already learned something different. Be useful. Be strong. Be calm. Solve problems. Don't become one. Maybe nobody ever said those exact words. Sometimes lessons don't arrive as sentences. They arrive as atmosphere, as expectations, as quiet rewards, as the way people looked relieved whenever he handled everything without needing help himself. Eventually, strength became performance. He got so good at it, he forgot it was a performance. Then she arrived, not asking him to impress her, not asking him to rescue her. Just asking him to let her see him. That should have been easier. Instead, it terrified him. Because fixing things had always felt safer than being seen. I would have stayed. Would you? I loved her. I know. But I loved her. Loving someone isn't always the same as letting them reach you. Silence. Again. He remembers another conversation. One he'd almost completely forgotten. They were grocery shopping. Standing in the cereal aisle. Of all places. She was comparing labels. He was checking his phone. She asked, Can I ask you something? Sure. When you're stressed. He nodded without looking up. Do you ever wish I wasn't around? He finally lifted his eyes. What? I don't mean forever. She smiled awkwardly. I just mean, sometimes I feel like when life gets difficult, you quietly push me outside your world. He laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he was uncomfortable. You're overthinking. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. He'll never know. Because he ended the conversation before curiosity had a chance to begin. Now, standing in another grocery store months later, he realizes something painful. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was asking whether she still belonged inside the parts of him that hurt. And without realizing it, he answered no. Not with words. With avoidance. There are moments that replay, so often they begin changing shape. At first, he replayed them to prove he wasn't entirely at fault. Then, to understand what happened. Eventually, he replayed them because they became the only place he could still hear her voice. Not the idealized version. The real one. The one that interrupted him. Laughed at bad jokes. Spoke too quietly when she was hurt. Said never mind when she actually meant, please ask me again. How many times had she said never mind? He starts counting. Too many. Far too many. One afternoon, he opens their old message thread. Not to text. Just to remember. He scrolls upward. Months. Hundreds of conversations. Photos of grocery lists. Random memes. Voice notes. Arguments. Apologies. Plans that never happened. He notices something strange. Near the end, her messages became shorter. Not colder. Smaller. As if she had slowly started taking up less emotional space. He hadn't noticed that while it was happening. Now it feels obvious. Painfully obvious. Maybe people don't always leave on the day they walk away. Maybe part of them leaves every time they stop believing they'll be heard. He closes the phone. Doesn't cry. Just sits there. Hands resting on his knees. Looking at nothing. Because this kind of regret doesn't explode. It settles. Like dust. Quietly covering everything. The hardest realization isn't that she tried. He always knew she tried. The hardest realization is discovering how many times she invited him into conversations he believed they had already finished. She wasn't repeating herself. She was reopening a door. He kept closing it. Not because he didn't care. Because he honestly believed the problem had already been solved. He had mistaken silence for resolution. She had mistaken patience for hope. Neither of them understood the other in time. Months ago, he walked away believing distance would make everything clearer. Now he understands something almost impossible to accept. Clarity didn't arrive because she disappeared. It arrived because, without her voice filling the room, he could finally hear the echoes of every conversation he had ended too soon. Every interrupted sentence. Every nervous laugh. Every quiet. It's okay. Every. Never mind. Every. I just wanted you to stay with me for a minute. He hears them now with painful precision. Not because memory became kinder. Because it finally became honest. And that may be the cruelest part of all. Sometimes the conversations that change a man's life are the ones he believed were already over. People often assume that if a man pulls away, it's because he stopped caring. Because he found someone else. Because the excitement disappeared. Because the relationship wasn't important enough. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes, the opposite is happening. Sometimes the moment he feels the deepest connection is exactly the moment he begins creating distance. Not because love disappears. Because it suddenly becomes real. And real things have the power to expose everything we've spent years trying not to see. The strangest part is, he probably doesn't even understand why he's doing it. If you asked him back then, why are you pulling away? He would have answered honestly, I'm not. Because from his perspective, he wasn't leaving. He was still calling. Still showing up. Still paying attention. Still saying, I love you. He genuinely believed nothing had changed. Meanwhile, she could feel it before she could explain it. She noticed conversations becoming shorter. His eyes drifting away while she talked. His hugs lasting just a little less. The way he answered, I'm fine. before she had even finished asking the question. Love hadn't disappeared. Presence had. And somehow, presence is usually what people miss first. There was one weekend that kept returning to him. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did. They had rented a little cabin outside the city. 2 days. No schedules. No deadlines. Just trees. Rain tapping against the windows. Coffee in oversized mugs. The kind of weekend people imagine will fix everything. The first day felt easy. They cooked together. Burned the garlic bread because they forgot the oven timer. Laughed about it. Played cards. Fell asleep on the couch halfway through a movie. It was peaceful. The kind of peace most people spend years searching for. The second morning. She was still asleep when he woke up. The cabin was completely silent. He looked over at her. Hair covering part of her face. One hand tucked under the pillow. Sunlight moving slowly across the blanket. She looked. Safe. Safe with him. And something unexpected happened. His chest tightened. Not with affection. With fear. A strange, unreasonable fear. He couldn't explain it. Everything was good. Maybe too good. He quietly got out of bed. Made coffee. Walked outside alone. Stood on the porch much longer than necessary. He remembers staring into the trees thinking, I need some space. Space from what? Nothing had happened. Exactly. Sometimes peace feels unfamiliar to people who've spent years preparing for disappointment. Chaos makes sense. Distance makes sense. Independence makes sense. But being deeply known, that can feel terrifying. Because now, there's something to lose. When he came back inside, she smiled. There you are. He smiled back. Couldn't sleep. She reached for his hand. He let her. But part of him was already somewhere else. Not because of her. Because closeness had quietly activated something he didn't have words for. It's difficult explaining fear when nothing looks wrong. People expect fear to arrive with obvious reasons. Arguments. Betrayal. Broken trust. Sometimes fear arrives because everything is finally working. And that feels almost impossible to admit. After that trip, small changes began happening. Nothing dramatic. He answered texts a little later. Worked a little longer. Started saying, I'm just tired. More often. Canceled one dinner because of work. Then another. She noticed. Of course she noticed. People notice emotional weather before storms become visible. One night she asked, Did I do something? The question landed heavily between them. No. You've been different. I've just been busy. I know what busy looks like. Silence. This feels different. He rubbed his forehead. I don't know what you want me to say. She looked down. I want you to tell me where you went. He frowned. I'm sitting right here. She smiled sadly. No. You're not. That conversation haunted him for months. Because at the time, he thought she was criticizing him. Now, he realizes she was searching for him. There's a painful difference. The human mind often confuses vulnerability with danger. Especially if vulnerability wasn't welcomed earlier in life. If being emotional once led to embarrassment. The body remembers. If asking for comfort once resulted in rejection. The body remembers. If love once disappeared without warning. The body remembers. Eventually, the nervous system starts protecting you before your mind even understands what it's protecting. He wasn't consciously deciding, I'm going to become emotionally unavailable. His body was quietly deciding, this closeness feels risky. So he worked later, scrolled longer, made more jokes, talked more about practical things. Anything, except what was actually happening inside him. From the outside, it looked like he cared less. Inside, he was managing more emotion than ever before. That's one of the cruel ironies of emotional avoidance. The person who appears the calmest is often carrying the loudest internal conversation. I should tell her. Tell her what? That I'm overwhelmed. Why don't you? I don't know. Yes, you do. What if she sees me differently? There it is. Not anger. Not pride. Fear. The quiet fear that being fully seen might somehow make him less worthy of being loved. Nobody had ever taught him how to stay emotionally present while feeling afraid. So he did what he'd always done. He became competent, productive, reliable, useful. Those identities had protected him before. Why wouldn't they protect him now? Except, relationships don't survive on usefulness alone. Someone can fix everything in the house and still leave another person feeling completely alone. She tried different approaches. Sometimes she asked directly. Sometimes gently. Sometimes she gave him space. Sometimes she reached for him first. Sometimes she stopped asking altogether. That last one, he barely noticed while it was happening. Later, it became impossible to forget, because people don't usually stop asking after one disappointment. They stop after many. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. One Sunday afternoon, they were building a bookshelf together. One of those inexpensive ones with confusing instructions and far too many screws. She kept laughing because they had accidentally attached one panel backward. He laughed too. For a while, everything felt easy again. Then, completely out of nowhere, she asked, "Are you happy?" Such a simple question. He answered immediately. "Of course." She looked at him for a second. "I mean, really?" He shrugged. "Yeah." She nodded. Never asked again. At the time, he felt relieved. Conversation avoided. Success. Months later, he realized something heartbreaking. That wasn't a conversation she gave up on. It was a question. She had wanted to know whether he was truly living beside her, or merely functioning beside her. He never answered that version, because he never heard it. The apartment grew quieter over the following months. Not because they argued more, because they spoke less. There's an enormous difference. Arguments mean people are still trying to reach each other. Silence often means they're getting tired. He confused peace with absence of conflict. She confused patience with possibility. Both misunderstandings slowly built the same bridge toward distance. Looking back, he notices another uncomfortable truth. Whenever she became more emotionally available, he often became less. She would tell him about a childhood memory. He'd change the subject. She would admit she felt insecure. He'd reassure her quickly, then move on. She would ask, "What are you thinking?" He'd answer, "Nothing. Nothing." Such a small word. It ended so many conversations. Not because nothing existed. Because everything did. Too much, actually. Too much to organize. Too much to explain. Too much to risk saying out loud. Nothing became easier. Nothing became safer. Nothing slowly became the wall between them. Months after she was gone, he finally understood something while folding laundry. Of all places, he picked up one of his old sweatshirts. The one she'd always borrowed. She used to disappear into it because it was much too big. He smiled, then remembered how often she'd hand it back after an argument. Quietly, without saying anything. He had always assumed she simply didn't need it anymore. Now, he wondered whether she had been returning more than a sweatshirt. Maybe she had been returning hope. Piece by piece. Without either of them naming it. People often ask, when did he realize he loved her? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe he always loved her. The harder question is this. When did he realize love wasn't the thing that had been missing? Presence was. Curiosity was. Emotional courage was. Love had been there all along. Hidden beneath fear. Hidden beneath competence. Hidden beneath all the ways he had learned to survive before she ever entered his life. The painful irony is that by the time he finally understood why he had become colder, he no longer felt cold at all. He felt everything. The tenderness he had buried. The conversations he had escaped. The questions he had answered too quickly. The silences he had mistaken for peace. He could finally see that every step backward had never been an absence of love. It had been an absence of safety within himself. And once he understood that, another truth quietly followed. She had not walked away because she stopped loving him. She walked away because she had spent too long trying to love someone who disappeared every time the relationship became real. Sometimes a man becomes colder not because his heart closes, but because it opens wider than he knows how to carry. And until he learns that intimacy is not something to survive, but something to remain inside of, the very love he longs for will continue to feel like the thing he has to escape. Only later, standing alone in the silence he once believed he needed, does he finally recognize the tragedy. He was never running from her. He was running from the version of himself that believed being fully loved meant having nowhere left to hide. Sometimes, the person we fall in love with doesn't simply change our life. They quietly introduce us to a version of ourselves we didn't know existed. Not by teaching us. Not by fixing us. Just by making us feel safe enough for that version to appear. And sometimes, losing them doesn't hurt only because they're gone. It hurts because the version of ourselves that existed beside them seems to disappear too. He didn't understand this at first. After the breakup, he kept saying the same thing to himself. I just miss her. It sounded true. It was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. Weeks passed. Then months. And little by little, another sentence began forming underneath the first one. I miss who I was when she was here. That realization frightened him, because it forced him to ask a question he had been avoiding. Was she the reason he had become that man? Or had she simply made it possible for that man to exist? He remembers a night from early in the relationship, long before things became complicated. They had been walking home after dinner. The streets were almost empty. The restaurants were closing. Someone across the road was stacking chairs onto tables. It had started raining unexpectedly. Not enough to run. Just enough to make the sidewalks shimmer under the streetlights. She reached for his hand without asking. Not dramatically. Not romantically. As naturally as someone reaching for a familiar light switch in the dark. He remembers something surprising. He didn't pull away. Normally, physical closeness made him slightly uncomfortable. Not because he disliked affection. Because he always felt strangely aware of himself. Where should his hand go? Was he holding too tightly? Not enough. Was he doing this correctly? Everything felt like performance. But that night, he forgot to perform. He simply walked, hand in hand, without thinking, without managing himself, without trying to become someone. For a little while, he was simply there, looking back. That wasn't about holding hands. It was about what happened inside him. For perhaps the first time in years, he stopped monitoring himself. Most people don't realize how exhausting constant self-monitoring can become. Always measuring your words. Always controlling your reactions. Always trying to appear calm. Strong. Capable. Predictable. After enough years, you forget you're doing it. It simply becomes your personality. Until someone quietly makes you forget the performance. She had a habit of laughing before finishing her own stories. Halfway through explaining something, she'd already be smiling because she knew the ending was ridiculous. Sometimes she'd laugh so hard she couldn't continue talking. He used to tease her. "Can you finish one story before laughing?" She'd shake her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm already there." He'd roll his eyes, then laugh anyway. Much later, he realized something. He laughed more around her than around anyone else. Not louder, more freely. There was a difference. He wasn't trying to be funny. He wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He simply laughed because his body forgot to stay guarded. That version of himself hadn't disappeared. It had simply stopped feeling safe enough to come outside. After she left, people noticed changes. His co-workers described him the same way they always had. Reliable, focused, professional, efficient. His friends still invited him everywhere. He still made jokes, still smiled, still functioned. Nothing seemed dramatically different. Except, he knew. He knew something essential had quietly gone missing. One afternoon, a coworker accidentally spilled coffee across an entire stack of reports. Everyone groaned. Someone cursed under their breath. Months earlier, he would have laughed first, made a joke, helped clean everything up. Instead, he simply stared. Not angry, just empty. His coworker looked embarrassed. "I'm so sorry." "It's fine." He helped clean the mess. Went back to work. Nobody noticed. But during the drive home, he couldn't stop thinking about something absurd. She would have laughed. Not at the mistake. At how seriously everyone was taking it. She always had a way of making ordinary disasters feel strangely human. Without her, everything felt heavier. Even things that shouldn't. He started wondering whether she had been changing the world around him, or whether she had simply been changing the way he experienced it. There was another memory, one he'd almost forgotten. A Sunday morning. They were grocery shopping. Again. It seemed like so many important conversations happened between cereal boxes and frozen vegetables. She wandered slowly through every aisle. He hated grocery shopping. Always had. He wanted to grab exactly what they needed and leave. She wanted to stop and look at everything. Taste samples. Read ingredients. Notice flowers. Smile at strangers. At one point, she picked up a ridiculously expensive jar of imported honey. Held it up. Read the label dramatically. Then asked, if money didn't matter, "Would you buy this?" He laughed. "No." "Why?" "It's honey." So, honey is honey." She looked at him. "No." "What do you mean no?" "There are people who go their whole lives believing honey is just honey." He laughed harder. "You're impossible." She shrugged. "Maybe. But at least life stays interesting." Months later, standing alone in another grocery store, he found himself stopping in front of that exact shelf. Not because he wanted honey. Because he suddenly realized something. She had been teaching him curiosity without ever calling it a lesson. She noticed things. He optimized things. She experienced moments. He completed tasks. Neither approach was wrong. But hers had quietly expanded his world. He hadn't seen that while she was beside him. He only noticed after the world started shrinking again. It's remarkable how another person's way of seeing life can become invisible while you're living inside it. Only after they leave. Do you realize how much of your own vision had borrowed their light? I've changed. Have you? I think so. Or, did someone simply allow more of you to exist? Silence. Again. He remembers how patient she was with silence. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind where nobody feels obligated to fill the air. They could drive for an hour. Windows cracked open. Music barely audible. Neither person talking. Yet somehow, he never felt lonely. Now, he sits through those same quiet drives alone. And silence feels completely different. Not because silence changed. Because presence did. One evening, he opened an old notebook looking for a receipt. Instead, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. It was a list. Not important. Just random things they wanted to do someday. Visit the coast in winter. Learn to make fresh pasta. Watch the sunrise without staying awake all night first. Buy plants they probably wouldn't keep alive. Dance in the kitchen at least once. He smiled. Then stopped. There was one line near the bottom. Written in her handwriting. Help each other become softer. He stared at those words for a very long time. He didn't even remember writing that list together. But she had. Apparently. Long enough to write it down. Softer. What an unusual goal. Most people spend their lives trying to become stronger. More successful. More respected. More disciplined. She had hoped they would become softer. Toward themselves. Toward each other. Toward life. He wondered if she had already sensed how tightly he held himself together. Maybe she had. Long before he ever did. He started noticing something else. He had become gentler while they were together. Not all the time. Not perfectly. But enough to matter. He called his parents more often. He stopped rushing through conversations. He noticed sunsets. He bought birthday gifts weeks in advance instead of the day before. He listened longer before interrupting. These weren't dramatic transformations. Nobody else would have noticed. But he did. Because now, one by one, those habits had quietly disappeared again. Not intentionally. They simply had no one encouraging that version of him anymore. For a while, he blamed himself. Then he blamed the breakup. Then he blamed timing. Eventually, he stopped blaming anyone. Instead, he became curious. Could that version of himself exist without her? Or had it belonged only to the relationship? That question stayed with him for weeks. One rainy afternoon, he stopped at a small coffee shop he'd never visited before. The young barista accidentally made the wrong drink. "I'm really sorry. I'll remake it." Normally, he would have accepted the replacement automatically. Instead, he surprised himself. "It's okay. I'll try this one." She smiled with visible relief. As he sat near the window sipping a drink he hadn't ordered, he noticed something. The old version of himself would have chosen efficiency. The version she had quietly awakened. Chose kindness. Not because someone was watching. Because something inside him had finally paused long enough to ask, "Does this really matter?" He smiled. For the first time in weeks. It wasn't because he remembered her. It was because he recognized himself. Maybe that was the beginning. Not of moving on. Something quieter than that. The beginning of understanding. She had never created the best parts of him. She had simply lived in a way that invited those parts to come forward. The patience. The curiosity. The gentleness. The willingness to notice small things. Those qualities had always existed somewhere beneath years of self-protection. She didn't install them. She uncovered them. And perhaps that was why losing her felt so devastating. Not only because he lost someone he loved, but because he mistakenly believed he had lost himself as well. Standing by the cafe window, watching strangers hurry through the rain, he finally understood something he wished he had known much earlier. The man she loved had never belonged to her. He had always belonged to him. She had only been the first person who made him feel safe enough to meet him. And perhaps, that is one of the quietest miracles love can perform. Not changing who someone is, but introducing them to the person they had been carrying inside all along. Most people think grief is loud. They imagine tears, sleepless nights, desperate phone calls, long messages that are never sent. Sometimes grief looks like all of those things. But sometimes, it looks like brushing your teeth, folding laundry, stopping at a red light, answering emails, smiling at coworkers, buying groceries, living an ordinary life while something invisible quietly rearranges you from the inside. Nobody sees that part. The world rarely notices silent heartbreak. It notices absence. It notices dramatic endings. It notices public apologies. But it almost never notices the private rituals that begin after everyone else believes the story is over. He developed routines without realizing it. Tiny habits. Almost impossible to explain. Every morning, before leaving for work, he checked that the apartment lights were off. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, living room. Then, almost automatically, he glanced toward the couch. For no reason. Just looked. She wasn't there. She hadn't been there for months. Still, his eyes searched. Not because he expected to find her. Because the body often remembers people long after the mind accepts reality. The strange thing about memory is that it isn't always emotional. Sometimes it's physical. His hand still reached toward the passenger seat whenever he stopped too suddenly. As if someone needed protecting. He still left extra room while walking down crowded sidewalks. Still turned slightly while opening doors. Still instinctively checked restaurant menus for things she liked before remembering there was only one person ordering now. Nobody noticed. How could they? These were movements so small they barely existed. Yet together, they quietly revealed the life that had once been shared. One Tuesday evening, he found himself standing in the produce section, holding 2 avocados. He stared at them longer than necessary. One would have been enough. She always insisted on buying 2. In case one isn't ripe. He used to tease her. You have trust issues with fruit. She would laugh. I have experience. He smiled to himself. Then, without thinking, he put the second avocado into the basket anyway, only realizing it after he reached the checkout. He stood there looking at it, almost embarrassed. Not because anyone else cared. Because the habit had survived longer than the relationship. Some people think healing happens in big moments. Sometimes, it happens inside grocery stores. One forgotten habit at a time. His apartment changed slowly. Not intentionally. Just. Gradually. The blanket she always folded over the arm of the couch disappeared into a closet. The second toothbrush eventually found its way into a drawer. The framed photo on the bookshelf stayed longer than he admitted to anyone. Not because he stared at it every day. Because eventually, he stopped seeing it. Until one afternoon, a friend came over. They were talking about work. About traffic. About completely ordinary things. His friend paused. Looked toward the bookshelf. You still have that picture. He followed his gaze. For a second, he genuinely forgot it was there. Oh. Silence. You okay? Yeah. Was he? He wasn't sure. The photo stayed another week. Then he placed it inside a box. Not because he wanted to erase her. Because every time someone else noticed it, he realized he had stopped noticing it himself. And somehow, that hurt even more. There are moments when forgetting feels crueler than remembering. At work, he became quieter. Not withdrawn. Just. Less available. People still asked him to lunch. He usually declined. I'm trying to finish something. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes. He simply couldn't imagine pretending to be interested in casual conversation. Not because he disliked people. Because small talk required energy. And grief had quietly become a full-time occupation nobody else could see. His co-workers admired his focus. If only I had your discipline. He almost laughed. Discipline? No. Distraction. There was a difference. Work became somewhere he could postpone feeling. For a few hours. Numbers were easier than memories. Deadlines were easier than silence. Spreadsheets never reminded him of Sunday mornings. Until one afternoon. He opened a shared document. Someone had accidentally named the file after a vacation destination. The same city they had once planned to visit together. Nothing important. Just a file name. 8 letters. Yet suddenly, he couldn't remember what anyone had been discussing in the meeting. His manager asked a question. He answered automatically. The room moved on. Nobody noticed the place he'd just disappeared to. That became another quiet thing. Leaving conversations without leaving the room. He stopped listening to certain songs. Not because they reminded him of her immediately. Because they reminded him of ordinary versions of himself. The version singing badly in the car. The version dancing while making breakfast. The version who didn't care if someone saw him looking ridiculous. He missed that man. Almost as much as he missed her. One Saturday, he decided to clean the apartment properly. Not the usual quick version. Everything. Closets. Drawers. Shelves. The storage boxes under the bed. Hours passed. Dust collected. Old receipts. Instruction manuals. Charging cables for devices he no longer owned. Near the back of one drawer, he found a birthday card. Not from her. From years earlier. Inside, she had written one sentence. I love how gentle you are when you think nobody's watching. He stared at those words. Gentle? His first reaction was confusion. That wasn't how he described himself. Reliable. Maybe. Reserved. Certainly. Gentle? Never. Yet. She had seen it. Apparently. Before he did. How many versions of ourselves exist only because somebody else noticed them first? That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the card. Not because it was romantic. Because it challenged something fundamental. If she believed gentleness existed inside him, why had he spent so much of his life convincing himself he needed to hide it? The answer didn't arrive. Only more questions. He started watching people more carefully. Not intentionally. It simply happened. An older couple sharing fries at a small diner. A father tying his daughter's shoe. 2 teenagers arguing over directions before laughing halfway through the disagreement. The cashier at the bookstore remembering someone's usual order. Tiny moments. Almost invisible. He wondered whether love had always looked this ordinary. Maybe he had spent too much time waiting for grand gestures. Maybe relationships were mostly built from things nobody photographed. There was one evening. Late autumn. The weather had finally turned cold. He walked past a neighborhood park on the way home. Children were gone. The swings moved slightly in the wind. Leaves scraped across the pavement. On one bench, an elderly man sat alone feeding birds. Slowly. Patiently. No phone. No rush. Just. There. For reasons he couldn't explain. He stopped walking. Watched for several minutes. The old man looked peaceful. Not happy. Not sad. Simply present. It occurred to him that presence had always been the thing she valued most. Not perfection. Not certainty. Presence. He wondered how many moments he had physically attended while emotionally absent. Too many. When he reached home, the apartment greeted him with the familiar silence. He placed his keys in the bowl by the door. Hung up his coat. Started making tea. The kettle began to whistle. Without thinking, he reached for 2 mugs. Again. He stopped. Closed his eyes. Smiled sadly. Then returned 1 mug to the cabinet. This time, it didn't feel like grief. Not exactly. More like recognition. a quiet acknowledgement that life had changed. The second mug no longer belonged on the counter. But it also didn't need to be hidden. Healing, he realized, wasn't forgetting which mug she used. It was reaching for two, and gently choosing one without feeling as though the decision erased everything that had come before. Weeks later, he ran into someone who hadn't seen him since the breakup. After a few minutes of conversation, they asked the question everyone eventually asks. "So, how are you doing now?" He almost answered automatically. "I'm good." Instead, he paused, looked down for a second, then smiled. "I'm getting there." Such ordinary words. Yet they were the most honest thing he'd said in months. Not healed. Not broken. Simply getting there. The other person nodded. Conversation continued. Neither of them realized how much courage that small sentence had required. Because healing rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive all at once on a bright morning. It doesn't declare that the hardest part is over. It slips quietly into ordinary life. Into buying one avocado instead of two. Into choosing one coffee mug. Into hearing an old song without changing the station immediately. Into answering a simple question with an honest answer instead of a convenient one. Nobody applauds those moments. Nobody writes stories about them. Yet those are often the moments that matter most. Late one evening, he stood by the apartment window. The city below looked almost exactly the same as it had months ago. Cars passed. Windows glowed. Someone walked a dog beneath the streetlights. Life had never stopped moving. Only he had. For a while. He rested one hand against the cool glass. Not thinking about getting her back. Not imagining another conversation. Not rewriting old memories. Just standing there. Breathing. Feeling the quiet settle around him without fighting it. For the first time since she left, the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like space. Not empty space. Living space. The kind where something new might eventually grow. And outside the window, unnoticed by everyone except him, a single apartment light across the street turned off. Another remained on. The city kept breathing. So did he. Quietly. One ordinary night at a time. There comes a point in every quiet heartbreak when the conversation with the other person finally ends. No more imagined text messages. No more rehearsed apologies. No more wondering what they would say. Instead, another conversation begins. One that is somehow even harder to escape. The conversation with yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small questions. Could I have done something differently? Did I really listen? Why didn't I tell her what I was feeling? Then, almost without noticing, the questions become arguments. The same thoughts circling each other every night. Never reaching a conclusion. Only becoming more familiar. He never raised his voice during these arguments. There was no one else in the room. Yet somehow, they were the loudest conversations he had ever experienced. I loved her. I know. So why wasn't that enough? Silence. I don't know. You do. The apartment had become strangely honest after she left. There was nobody to interrupt his thoughts anymore. No television loud enough. No work deadline urgent enough. No phone call long enough. Eventually, every distraction ended. And there he was. Again. Sitting across from himself. He developed a habit of leaving the television on without watching it. The sound filled the room. News anchors. Cooking shows. Old movies. It didn't matter what was playing. He wasn't listening. He simply wanted another voice to exist in the apartment besides his own. One evening, the television shut itself off after several hours. The room instantly became quiet. He stared at the black screen, then heard himself whisper, "There it is." The silence. Not outside. Inside. He had spent months believing he was grieving her. Now he realized. He was also grieving the man he had believed himself to be. Reliable. Loving. Present. Those words no longer fit as comfortably as they once had. Not because they were lies. Because they had been incomplete. One Saturday morning, he decided to go for a long walk. No destination. Just movement. The city looked exactly as it always had. Parents pushing strollers. People carrying coffee. Dogs pulling impatiently on their leashes. The ordinary rhythm of strangers continuing their lives. He wondered how many of them were having invisible conversations too. How many smiling faces contained unfinished arguments no one else would ever hear. He stopped outside a bookstore. Not because he wanted to buy anything. Because she had always stopped there. Even if only for 5 minutes. She loved wandering between shelves without looking for a specific title. He used to wait near the entrance. Checking his phone. Growing impatient. Hurry up. He could almost hear himself saying it. She would smile. I'm almost done. She never was. She always found one more shelf. One more book. One more reason to stay. At the time, he thought she was wasting time. Now, he wondered whether she had simply understood something he hadn't. Maybe life wasn't meant to be completed as efficiently as possible. Maybe it was meant to be noticed. He walked inside. For the first time alone. The smell of paper. Coffee from the small cafe upstairs. The quiet sound of pages turning. He wandered without purpose. Exactly the way she used to. After 20 minutes. He realized something. He hadn't checked his phone once. He smiled. Then almost immediately, the familiar argument returned. See, you can change. So why didn't I change then? No answer. That became the pattern. Every moment of growth was immediately followed by regret. Every new understanding became another reason to criticize his old self. I finally understand. Too late. I didn't know then. You should have. I was trying. Not hard enough. Round and round. Night after night. There was one memory he could never settle. It returned with almost perfect clarity. A Thursday evening. She had come home exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. He remembered she sat on the edge of the bed without taking off her shoes. Just sat there. Quietly. He asked. Long day? She nodded. He waited. She said nothing. After a minute, he stood up. I'll make dinner. She looked at him. Okay. That was all. Nothing dramatic happened. They ate. Watched television. Went to bed. At the time, he thought he had done something kind. Now, the memory refused to leave him. Because he finally heard something he hadn't heard before. She hadn't needed dinner first. She had needed company. He had solved the problem he understood. Not the one she was living. The mind has a remarkable ability to rewrite old scenes once new understanding arrives. Every memory began revealing details he had never noticed. The way she hesitated before speaking. The way she sometimes looked disappointed for only half a second before smiling again. The questions she stopped asking. The stories she stopped telling halfway through. Not because she was angry. Because she had quietly adjusted her expectations. That realization stayed with him longer than any argument they had ever had. One rainy evening. He opened the notes app on his phone. He didn't intend to write. He simply needed somewhere to place the thoughts that refused to stop repeating themselves. He typed one sentence. I wish I had stayed. He stared at it. Then deleted it. Typed another. I didn't know how. Deleted that too. Another. I'm sorry. Delete. Eventually, he placed the phone face down. No sentence felt complete enough. Because the apology wasn't only for leaving conversations too early, or hiding behind work, or pretending everything was fine. The apology was larger than language. He wanted to apologize for every version of himself that had been too frightened to remain emotionally visible. How do you write that? He didn't know. Weeks later, while cleaning his email inbox, he found an old reservation confirmation. A restaurant. 2 people. Friday. 7:30. He remembered that night immediately. She had been excited to try the place. He had arrived late. Work had run over. He spent most of dinner answering messages. Not constantly. Just enough. Every few minutes. Buzz. Quick reply. Buzz. I'm listening. Buzz. Sorry. Buzz. One more email. He remembered driving home thinking dinner had gone well. Now, he remembered something else. At one point, she had stopped telling the story she was in the middle of. He never asked her to continue. Neither of them mentioned it. It simply disappeared. Just like so many other small moments. The argument inside him became quieter after that. Not because he forgave himself. Because he finally stopped defending himself. There is a difference. For months, part of him had spent every night building a case. I was stressed. I was doing my best. I didn't mean to hurt her. All true. Every one of them. Yet, truth can become a shield. Eventually, he grew too tired to keep holding it. One evening he simply admitted, yes, I loved her. And yes, I still failed her sometimes. Those 2 sentences no longer felt like enemies. They could exist together. Love does not automatically create emotional skill. Good intentions do not automatically create understanding. Admitting that didn't erase the love. It simply made the story more honest. Something unexpected happened after that. The argument changed. Instead of accusing himself, his mind became curious. What were you afraid of? Nobody had asked him that before. Not even himself. He sat with the question. Longer than he expected. Finally, an answer arrived. I was afraid that if she saw how uncertain I really was, she would stop believing in me. The room stayed silent. Then another realization quietly followed. She hadn't been asking for certainty. She had been asking for honesty. Somewhere along the way, he had confused the two. Late one night, he found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror. The apartment was dark except for the small light above the sink. He looked tired. Older somehow. Not because of age. Because of recognition. He searched his own face as though meeting someone unfamiliar. Then he said something out loud. Not to practice. Not because anyone could hear. Simply because the words deserved a voice. You didn't lose her in one day. His reflection said nothing. You lost her. One unfinished conversation at a time. He closed his eyes. That sentence hurt. Not because it was cruel. Because it felt true. The next morning, he passed a construction site on his way to work. Workers were repairing an old brick wall. Not replacing it. Repairing it. One brick at a time. Removing damaged pieces. Keeping the parts that were still strong. He stood there longer than necessary. Watching. Nobody rushed. Nobody tried to rebuild the entire wall in one movement. Each brick had to be touched separately. He thought about memory. About regret. About himself. Perhaps that was how people changed too. Not all at once. Not through one revelation. But through hundreds of quiet corrections. One conversation understood differently. One habit noticed. One assumption questioned. One truth accepted. Then another. And another. That evening, he returned home. Placed his keys in the bowl. made himself tea, sat beside the window as rain tapped softly against the glass. For the first time in a very long while, the voice inside him wasn't accusing. It wasn't defending. It wasn't trying to rewrite the past. It simply sat beside him, like an old friend who had finally stopped arguing. The rain continued. Cars passed beneath the streetlights. Somewhere in another apartment, someone laughed. Somewhere else, someone was probably saying goodbye. Life kept unfolding in thousands of ordinary rooms. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug, not searching anymore for a verdict, not trying to decide whether he had been a good man or a bad one, only recognizing that he had been a human one, someone who had loved imperfectly, someone who had hidden when he should have stayed, someone who had finally become quiet enough to hear the truth without needing to win the argument against himself. For a long time, he believed her leaving was the event that changed him. It seemed obvious. She disappeared. He suffered. He reflected. He understood. The story appeared simple. Cause, then consequence. Loss, then awakening. But life is rarely that neat. Months passed before another possibility quietly entered his mind. What if her disappearance wasn't actually the lesson? What if it was only the silence that finally allowed him to hear the lesson that had been speaking all along? He thought back to countless evenings together. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just ordinary moments. She would be reading on one end of the couch. He would answer emails on the other. Sometimes she would look up, watch him for a second, then ask, "What are you thinking about?" He always answered the same way. Nothing. It wasn't true. There was always something. Work. Money. His father. The future. The pressure he carried but never explained. He simply didn't know how to let someone enter those rooms inside him. So he closed the door before anyone could knock. Now, sitting alone in the exact same place, he realized something almost unbearable. She hadn't been asking because she needed information. She had been asking because she wanted to know where he lived emotionally. And every time he answered, nothing, she quietly remained outside. People often imagine relationships ending with one terrible mistake, one betrayal, one unforgettable fight. Sometimes that happens. But sometimes, relationships fade because of conversations that never happen, questions that never receive real answers, feelings that remain untranslated, doors that remain politely closed, until eventually, both people stop knocking. He remembered an autumn afternoon. They had gone to a local farmer's market. She wandered slowly between flower stalls, stopping every few steps, touching lavender, smelling rosemary, admiring pumpkins that looked almost too perfect to be real. He had checked the time. Twice. "We should probably go." She smiled. "We have nowhere to be. We've already been here an hour." "So?" He laughed impatiently. "I just don't understand how you can spend so long looking at vegetables." She laughed too. "They're not vegetables." "What are they?" "They're today." He shook his head. "You make everything sound philosophical." "No." She smiled gently. "I just don't like rushing through things I'll never get back." At the time, he rolled his eyes. Now, that conversation returned with entirely different weight. She hadn't been talking about vegetables, or flowers, or markets. She had been talking about life. There were so many moments like that. Tiny conversations that seemed forgettable, until time quietly translated them. One Sunday, he drove past the small cafe where they used to meet before work. Without thinking, he pulled into the parking lot. The place looked almost identical. Same outdoor tables. Same old chalkboard menu. Same cracked flower pot near the entrance. Inside, someone else now sat at their usual table. Two strangers. Laughing. Sharing a pastry. Completely unaware that another story had once occupied that exact corner. He ordered coffee. Sat by the window. Watched people come and go. It struck him how many invisible histories every place must contain. Every bench. Every restaurant. Every street. People fall in love there. Break apart there. Grow older there. Heal there. The walls never explain any of it. They simply remain. As he stirred his coffee, he remembered something she once said. You know what scares me? What? One day we'll stop being curious about each other. He had laughed. That's never going to happen. She smiled. I hope you're right. He thought curiosity belonged to the beginning of relationships. She understood it belonged to the middle. And the end. Somewhere along the way. He had stopped asking questions. Not because he stopped caring. Because he believed he already knew her. He knew her favorite coffee. Her favorite movie. The songs she skipped every time they came on. The way she tucked one leg underneath herself while reading. The tiny scar on her left hand. He mistook familiarity for understanding. But people are never finished becoming themselves. Every month. Every year. They quietly change. She kept discovering new parts of herself. He kept loving the version he already knew. Neither of them realized the distance growing between those two things. One evening, after work, she had asked, Can I tell you something weird? Sure. I don't think you've asked me a new question in a long time. He laughed. What do you mean? I don't know. She searched for words. You know facts about me. But lately, it feels like you've stopped wondering about me. At the time, he didn't understand the difference. Now, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Facts remain still. People don't. He wondered how often she had been quietly changing while he was busy trying to keep everything stable. There was another memory. A small one. Almost invisible. They had been assembling furniture together. One screw refused to fit. He became frustrated. She started laughing. What? You always look personally offended when furniture wins. I'm not offended. You are. I'm trying to fix it. I know. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to win every problem. He sighed. I just want it finished. She looked at him. I know. Then after a pause. But sometimes, being together is more important than finishing. He finally understood why she smiled so often during difficult moments. She wasn't ignoring the problem. She simply refused to let the problem become more important than the person beside her. How many opportunities had he missed? Not because he lacked love, but because he confused efficiency with care. As winter arrived, he found himself noticing couples everywhere. Not because there were suddenly more of them, because he had finally become the kind of person who observed instead of hurried. At the train station, a woman quietly brushed snow from her husband's coat. At the grocery store, a man patiently waited while his partner compared 5 different brands of pasta. At a traffic light, someone reached across the car to squeeze another person's hand without saying a word. None of it looked extraordinary. Yet somehow, it all did. Love, he realized, had probably always looked like this. Not dramatic declarations. Tiny acts of attention repeated over years. The things nobody posts. The things nobody applauds. The things that quietly become a life. One afternoon, he received a message from an old friend. How've you been? He stared at the screen. Months ago, he would have replied, busy. Now, he wrote something else. Learning. The friend answered with a question mark. He smiled. Deleted the message. Typed again. It's been a strange year. That felt closer to the truth. Not because he had figured everything out, because he had stopped pretending that understanding arrived all at once. That evening, he found an old voice memo on his phone. He almost deleted it. Instead, he pressed play. The recording wasn't important. They had accidentally recorded themselves while trying to remember a grocery list. Most of it was laughter. Half-finished sentences. Her teasing him for forgetting milk. His joking that milk wasn't essential. Then, near the end, there was a few seconds of silence. Not awkward. Comfortable. Then she quietly said, "I like this." "What?" "This." "What is this?" She laughed softly. "Nothing special." He answered, "It's literally us forgetting groceries." "I know. I like ordinary with you." The recording ended. He sat completely still. Those words echoed through the apartment. "I like ordinary with you. Not vacations. Not anniversaries. Not perfect moments. Ordinary." He finally understood something that had been hidden in plain sight. She had never been asking him to become extraordinary. She had only wanted him to be fully present inside ordinary life. The realization didn't arrive like lightning. It settled gently, like dust finding a windowsill, like evening light slowly filling a room. Her disappearance hadn't created wisdom. It had only removed the noise that prevented him from hearing what she had been saying for years. She had never asked him to become someone else. She had never demanded impossible perfection. She hadn't wanted constant romance, or endless reassurance, or dramatic promises. She wanted his attention, his curiosity, his honesty, his presence. Things that sound almost too small to matter. Until they're gone. As spring quietly returned, he walked through the neighborhood where they had once lived. Trees were beginning to bloom again. Children rode bicycles. Someone watered flowers on a balcony. The bakery on the corner still placed fresh bread in the window every morning. Life had continued with astonishing confidence. He stopped beneath a tree whose branches stretched over the sidewalk. Months earlier, he would have stood there wondering whether she ever walked this street anymore. Whether she thought about him. Whether she missed him. This time, a different thought appeared. He hoped someone was paying attention to the way she laughed now. He hoped someone asked her new questions. He hoped someone noticed when she became quiet. Not because he wanted another man to replace him. Because he finally understood what she had deserved all along. That realization surprised him. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like love stripped of possession. The breeze moved softly through the branches above him. Tiny white blossoms loosened from the tree. One by one, they drifted toward the pavement. None of them hurried. None of them resisted the wind. They simply let go when it was time. He watched until the last petal settled near his shoes. Then he continued walking. Not because the story had ended, but because he finally understood that her leaving had never been the lesson. The lesson had been there all along. Hidden inside quiet conversations. Ordinary mornings. Unfinished dinners. Shared grocery lists. Comfortable silences. And a woman who never asked him to become extraordinary. Only fully awake to the life they were already living together. There is an uncomfortable truth that very few people like to admit. Sometimes, understanding arrives after the opportunity has already gone. Not because life is cruel. Not because love wasn't real. Simply because people often become ready only after they have lived long enough to recognize who they used to be. For months, he secretly imagined another conversation. Not the desperate kind. Not the dramatic reunion people write movies about. Just one ordinary conversation. A quiet afternoon. 2 cups of coffee. A chance to tell her everything he finally understood. No speeches. No promises. Only honesty. He imagined saying, "I know now." Then he would stop. Because even in his imagination, He wasn't sure what those 3 words could repair. One evening, while driving home from work, his phone lit up with a familiar name. Not hers. Her sister's. His heart stumbled anyway. He hadn't spoken to anyone in her family for almost a year. The message was simple. I found one of your books while cleaning. Would you like it back? He stared at the screen for several minutes before answering. Sure. Thank you. Nothing more. No questions. No curiosity disguised as politeness. No. How is she? He thought about asking. His fingers even typed the words. Then erased them. Some questions belong to another version of your life. They agreed to meet the following Saturday. A small neighborhood cafe. 10 in the morning. The kind of place where conversations naturally stay quiet. He arrived early. Not because he was nervous. Because he had finally become someone who no longer liked making people wait. She walked in carrying a canvas tote bag. Smiled warmly. It's good to see you. You too. She placed the book on the table. I figured you might still want this. He looked at it. A hardcover novel. Its pages slightly bent. A coffee stain near one corner. He remembered lending it years earlier. Before everything. Before endings. Before all the things he now understood. They talked for 20 minutes. About work. Her parents. The weather. A restaurant that had recently closed. The conversation stayed gentle. Comfortable. Until finally, she smiled. You seem different. He looked up. Different. Calmer. He laughed quietly. I think. Slower. She nodded. I can see that. Neither of them explained what that meant. They didn't have to. Eventually, she stood to leave. He almost asked. Almost. How is she? Is she happy? Has she found someone? Does she still? Instead, he simply said, Take care. You too. She left. The cafe door closed softly behind her. And he realized something unexpected. Not asking the question didn't feel like giving up. It felt like respecting the life that continued beyond his place in it. Weeks later, spring settled fully into the city. The trees outside his apartment filled with leaves again. The mornings grew warmer. Windows stayed open longer. He found himself walking instead of driving whenever he could. Not because he was trying to clear his head. Because walking allowed him to notice things. A little girl teaching her younger brother how to ride a bicycle. An old couple planting flowers outside their building. Someone playing the piano through an open apartment window. The melody drifted down the street. Incomplete. Occasionally interrupted by mistakes. Yet somehow, beautiful because of them. He stopped beneath the window until the song ended. Then continued walking. Thinking about how imperfect things often stay with us longer than perfect ones. There was one place he hadn't visited since the breakup. The lake. They used to come there on Sunday evenings. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they simply watched the water until sunset. He parked nearby. Walked the familiar path. The benches had been repainted. The trees were taller. Children chased pigeons across the walkway. Joggers passed wearing headphones. Life had continued decorating the same landscape with new people. He found the bench they used to sit on. It was occupied. A young couple shared a bag of chips. Laughing over something on a phone screen. He didn't feel jealous. Or sad. He simply kept walking. The bench had never belonged to them. It had always belonged to time. He reached the edge of the lake. The water reflected the late afternoon sky. Clouds drifted slowly across its surface. A duck glided through the reflection, breaking it apart without disturbing the sky above. He watched the ripples spread. Disappear. Then settle again. It reminded him of memory. The past never vanished. It simply stopped disturbing every surface. He sat on the grass instead. For the first time, he wasn't replaying conversations. He wasn't imagining different endings. He wasn't rehearsing apologies. He was simply remembering. And memory, without resistance, felt surprisingly gentle. He remembered her laughing because he could never fold fitted sheets. He remembered rainy mornings when they argued over who had to buy groceries. He remembered the way she always warmed her cold hands against his arm in winter. He remembered forgetting anniversaries. Remembered burning pancakes. Remembered long drives with the windows down. Remembered ordinary Tuesday evenings that never seemed important while they were happening. Funny how ordinary days become extraordinary only after they are gone. A breeze moved across the lake. He closed his eyes. For just a moment, he imagined she was sitting beside him. Not as a ghost. Not as fantasy. Only as memory. He could almost hear her asking, "What are you thinking about?" This time, he answered. Quietly. Out loud. "You were right." The wind carried the words away. There was nobody there to hear them. Yet somehow, that didn't matter. Some truths aren't spoken to receive forgiveness. They're spoken because they finally deserve daylight. Summer arrived. His life continued. Not dramatically. Just. Steadily. He accepted invitations more often. Called his parents without waiting for a special reason. Cooked meals that required patience. Read books without skipping chapters. Asked friends how they were. And waited long enough to hear the real answer. Nobody congratulated him. Nobody noticed. From the outside, he looked almost exactly the same. The same apartment. The same job. The same morning coffee. The same quiet personality. But inside, his life had become less about proving himself. More about being present. One afternoon, while helping a coworker carry boxes into the office, she apologized for moving so slowly. "I've had a rough week." Months earlier, he probably would have smiled politely and kept walking. Instead, he stopped. "What happened?" She hesitated, then told him. For 10 minutes they stood beside the elevator. Not solving anything. Just talking. When the conversation ended, she smiled. "Thanks for listening." He realized he hadn't offered advice once. He hadn't searched for solutions. He had simply stayed. A small moment. Easy to miss. Yet somewhere deep inside, he recognized it immediately. He had become the man she had once hoped he could be. That realization hurt. Not because he regretted changing. Because she would probably never know. Life doesn't always allow us to become who someone needed while they're still beside us. Sometimes, our growth belongs to people we haven't even met yet. Autumn returned. Almost exactly 1 year after they had separated. The air carried that familiar coolness again. Leaves collected along the sidewalks. The bakery began selling cinnamon bread every morning. Everything looked strangely familiar. Yet he no longer felt like the same man walking through it. One Saturday, he cleaned the apartment, opened windows, changed the bedsheets, watered the plants he had somehow managed to keep alive. While dusting a bookshelf, he found the old notebook again. The one with the bucket list. Visit the coast in winter. Learn fresh pasta. Watch sunrise. Buy plants. Dance in the kitchen. Help each other become softer. He smiled. 3 items were crossed out. Not because he had been trying to complete the list. Because life had quietly continued. He had visited the coast alone. Learned to make pasta after watching countless failed tutorials. Bought plants that somehow survived despite his inexperience. The final line remained untouched. Help each other become softer. He stared at it for a long time. Then, very gently, he closed the notebook. Some dreams don't disappear. They simply changed shape. Perhaps softness didn't belong only inside one relationship. Perhaps it could become the way he moved through every relationship, every friendship, every ordinary encounter. That evening, the sun began setting earlier than usual. Golden light spilled through the apartment window, landing across the wooden floor. He made tea. One mug. Sat near the window. Opened the book her sister had returned months earlier. A dried maple leaf slipped from between the pages. He didn't remember placing it there. Maybe she had. Maybe he had. It no longer mattered. He picked it up carefully. The leaf had lost its bright red color. It had become fragile, almost weightless. Yet every vein remained visible. Time hadn't erased its shape. It had only changed its color. He turned the leaf slowly between his fingers, then placed it back inside the book. Closed the cover. Outside, the evening settled gently over the city. Apartment lights blinked on one by one. Someone laughed on the sidewalk below. A bicycle bell rang in the distance. Somewhere, two people were probably meeting for the first time. Somewhere else, someone was saying goodbye. Life continued weaving beginnings and endings together without asking permission. He lifted the warm mug with both hands, looked out across the glowing windows. For a long moment, he thought about love, not as something he had lost, not as something he hoped to recover, but as something that had quietly changed the architecture of the person he would become. Sometimes, the awakening comes too late to save the relationship, but not too late to save the person who lived inside it. He watched the last light disappear behind the rooftops. The room slowly filled with evening. He didn't reach to turn on the lamp immediately. He simply sat there, between daylight and darkness, holding a warm cup of tea, while the city breathed around him. And somewhere inside that quiet, without anyone noticing, a man who had once mistaken silence for emptiness finally understood the difference.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.